Well, let's talk now to Benjamin Barney from the RAND Corporation, which has carried out research into IS funding, and Dr. Andreas Krieg, who works at King's College London and is also an advisor to the Qatari Armed Forces. Thank you both for talking to us. Benjamin Barney, how do IS get the oil out of Iraq and Syria, and who is buying it?
Well, typically, IS sells oil at the wellhead to local truckers who, up until recently, have been lining up at the oil fields to take the oil in trucks and then take it off for sale further on down the line. What we know is, in some cases, they've taken it to local refineries. They've taken it into Kurdistan and into Turkey. For the most part, they've also sold some oil to the Assad regime as well. So for the most part, we know it kind of stays locally within the surrounding countries, but they're, these oil traders are taking it outside of the ISIS territories.
Right. So it's distributed, if you like, and sold on by middlemen, for example, because the Assad regime buying oil from IS strikes me as, bizarre.
It is a bit bizarre, but it goes even deeper than that. They also are co-managing a whole host of gas plants as well. The Assad regime's electrical infrastructure largely relies on gas refineries that are in ISIS territory. So not only is ISIS selling the Assad regime oil, they're also managing the Assad regime's gas infrastructure that's keeping the lights on.
Wow, even though they're fighting each other on the ground in Syria. Let me bring in Dr. Andreas Krieg. Oil, clearly a big chunk of IS's money, but as a revenue stream, it has been decreasing. It's worth telling our audience about the money that they make collecting taxes from people for the services that they provide. In effect, a sort of quasi-state, if you like.
Correct. The mistake that a lot of people make is looking at ISIS as a terrorist organization, and primarily they're an insurgency group, which means they're governing territory, they're governing people, there are millions of people living in their territory. And as a state, they're raising taxes, and they have been raising more and more taxes over the past year because they obviously are a bit in a, they have a lot of public services that they have to provide and that they have to pay for. So they've been raising more and more taxes, and the extortion rate and the extortion money that they get from taxes, from bribes, from checkpoint money, from everybody who wants to do any business with or in the Islamic State, anybody who wants to pass through the Islamic State has to pay money. And that money is being raised in the billions. We estimate that probably last year they roughly raised $1 billion just worth of taxes and extortion money. So that is the most significant chunk. We would say it's probably 50% of their revenue is extortion. And we see, as long as people stay within the Islamic State, living in the Islamic State and paying taxes, this revenue stream is not going to be able to be targeted by anybody from outside.
And interestingly, when IS took Mosul, for example, as we explained in our film, that generated a lot of money, and they then lowered taxes for the people living in the area.
Of course. Well, that's part of their insurgency strategy. They learned, they're far away, they're far ahead from Al-Qaeda or from other terrorist organizations. They understand winning over hearts and minds of the people is key. And this is also key for us if we want to fight this insurgency. But they basically seized almost $800 million with the seizure of Mosul. And they used that money to reinvest it into infrastructure, reinvesting it into public services, cutting taxes, providing free food, and so on and so forth, to win over the Iraqi, especially Iraqi population, but also Syrian population.
Benjamin Barney, according to your organisation, IS's total revenue rose from just under, I think, $1 million per month in late 2008 to between $1 million and $3 million per day in 2014. That is just extraordinary.
Yeah, it really is. I think the way you explain that is that really ISIS has been able to exploit fissures within the Iraqi and Syrian societies, and that's allowed them to grow tremendously. And really what's given them the ability to grow is a robust organization. They have an organizational model that they've really deployed and spread out across the different territories that they're in. That's really given them the backbone to kind of grow their state upon. It's allowed them to collect taxes. It's allowed them to actually regulate commerce and to regulate the practices of individuals within those areas. So they've grown quite a bit. They've had a lot of military successes. They had a huge opening with the Syrian civil war that occurred. So it's no surprise to me that they've commensurately been able to increase their revenue as well. But as the other speaker said, they've also had to increase their spending. They've gone from having on the order of a few thousand individuals in the group now to potentially up to 100,000. And then they're providing some public services as well, although I think I would characterize it as being less public services than what they do, really just providing for the internal members of the organization.
Sure. Can I ask you both, and Benjamin, you first of all, about something that I hear, that I read about on a regular basis, donations from wealthy individuals in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I've never really seen much evidence that in particular, Saudi donations make up any really significant portion of ISIS's revenue. Since we've been following ISIS, which goes back almost 10 years, we've never seen that foreign donations as a whole, let alone from one particular country, have really added up to any significant part of ISIS's revenue picture. So I can't discount that donations from places like Saudi Arabia are happening. I'm willing to bet that they're happening from other countries as well, but I don't see it as being a particularly meaningful part of their overall finances.
Andreas, Krieg, do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that. I think this is not very credible. It's not, like I said, it's not a terrorist organization. Al-Qaeda used to get a lot of funding from private donors. Al-Qaeda in Iraq probably received some money from private donors in the early stages, but as Benjamin rightly said, I mean, this is really insignificant within the greater scheme of things.
Okay, so the solution then, what are the best ways to cut off the funding of IS? Andreas, first of all.
Well, like I said, this is an insurgency problem. This is not something, initially people were trying in last summer 2014, there was an initiative here together with the Gulf countries to clamp down on foreign donations to ISIS, but as I said, this is not very significant. So what we really need to do is looking at this insurgency and seeing that the center of gravity for this organization, for ISIS, for the so-called Islamic State, is the civilian population. So we need to somewhat divorce the civilian population who are pragmatically supporting ISIS. They're not supporting them because they believe in their ideology. I would say the majority of people who live in the Islamic State, for them this is the better alternative to supporting and living under the regime, which is on the one hand the Damascus regime and the other one is the Baghdad regime. So if we can divorce them from the Islamic State, make them turn their back towards the Islamic State and stop paying taxes, that would be a major step forward. So we need to develop a social political narrative and a social political alternative to the Islamic State for people to basically seek refuge in. And this is something militarily, but also financially, something that would undermine the stability of the Islamic State. Bombing them this is just piecemeal. I mean, even destroying the refineries, there will always be people who will sell oil one way or the other to the Turks, to the Kurds, or to other territory, or to the Assad regime, because people want to make money. And the Islamic State has undersold the oil price, undersold the oil under the market price, which now has become a little bit more difficult because the oil price is down anyway. But this is I was in Kurdistan last year, and I was speaking to the Peshmerga forces, the Kurdish forces, and they were telling me that even people on their own, under their watch, more or less, were allowing money from oil from the Islamic State to be sold in their territory because it was just so cheap and people want to make money.
Wow. Benjamin, the solution?
Yeah, I think I'm going to disagree with Andreas to a certain extent. I think that there are important population-centric aspects of the problem. But I think for the most part, the people under ISIS's rule aren't particularly happy with their situation, are not particularly happy with ISIS. They may not also be happy with some of the potential alternatives like the Assad regime or in Iraq, the Iraqi government. But I think by and large, this idea that people are pretty happy with ISIS, things are going well, is really not representative of what's happening. And what we've seen in the course of the last year is that ISIS's provision of services has really fallen off. The support of the local populations has fallen off. People are trying to leave, and ISIS is keeping people into the territories, not allowing them to exit. And I think, with regard to clamping down on the revenue, I do think it's going to be a challenge to clamp down on the taxation and extortion. That really is derived from ISIS's control of territory. So in order to really cramp down on that, you have to take the territory away from them, take away their ability to really have a monopoly of force in their areas. Military issue, and that's going to have to be done by local forces on the ground, the Kurds, local Syrian forces like potentially the Free Syrian Army, and the Iraqi security forces. But I think another important aspect, and this is something that we're really seriously doing now as a coalition, as you mentioned earlier, is going after ISIS's oil infrastructure. And I think the meaningful way to do this is to go after choke points. And really the only choke point I see in the system is the wellheads themselves. There are 2 oil fields in eastern Syria that make up the majority of the crude oil production in ISIS territories. If we can make it clear to the oil truckers that they're not going to be allowed to leave those areas, that the air campaign is going to take away their ability to move oil away from there, it's possible that we can actually restrict the overall ability of ISIS to produce oil and to move it, which I think can potentially put a serious crimp on ISIS's oil revenue. And this is something that we seem to be trying to do now.
One quick question, I'll put it to you, Andreas. It's from a viewer on WhatsApp. Why doesn't the coalition block the bank accounts where the money is held? I mean, are the billions of dollars held in conventional bank accounts, albeit under pseudonyms or whatever?
Well, both. I mean, there's a lot of cash flow going on, and there are a lot of. I mean, last year some of the money some of the assets they seized in Mosul were actually in gold bullions or in foreign cash reserves. So the money is not just being held in conventional bank accounts. And then there's pseudonyms. I mean, there are a lot of people who, there's in Turkey, for example, the border doesn't really exist anymore in some parts between the Islamic State and Turkey, because people can move freely from one side of the border to the other, and they can bring cash outside the country and open a bank account outside the country. Yeah. So there are conventional and unconventional means, and it's true. I mean, some of the governments in the region, and I have to say Turkey as well, they really have to clamp down on this kind of transport activity.
Okay, really interesting. Thank you so much, both of you. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much. That's Benjamin Barney from the RAND Corporation. They've carried out research into IS funding, and Dr. Andreas Krieg, who works at King's College London and is also an advisor to the Qatari Armed Forces.